Okay, so looking at the different aspects of music, we're now up into labeling the different inappropriate content, so that parents and consumers can see ahead of time what might be considered obscene and why, whether we're looking at sexual imagery, violent imagery, excessive drug use, explicit drug use, etc. This is also the labeling of albums. Why did it start in the early 80s, but finally the legislation get passed in the late 80s? Is, as I say here, political confusion, because this cuts down two different avenues. One dealing with moral authority, one dealing with censorship, and conservatives just putting political parties into two big lumps of conservatives and liberals. And I know that there's a wide range in that, but generally speaking, conservatives hate government meddling in everyday life, meaning it should be the parents who have the moral authority to show to teach their kids what they want, but they're also concerned about public decency. If we just are going to allow the parents to decide, well, what if some parents are lax and allow their kids to see more, want to see more, etc., where is that going to leave us? So for the conservatives, there's the issue of leaving moral authority but not leaving too much. For the liberals, they don't want censorship, they want free movement of ideas, but they're also concerned with impacts that music has, because they recognize that there is an impact by music on listeners, whether it be suicidal teens, teens from broken homes, etc. They're going to take to heart some of these messages. And so if we let just everything go out there and inundate people, some people are going to walk away with a really negative message. And so we've got to balance those two things of leaving the moral authority, but at the same time recognizing that some censorship may be needed. And so how are we going to balance that? Because the Miller test only takes us part of the way. If we're talking about sexual imagery, the Miller test is fine. But what if we are talking about violence? What if we are talking about explicit drug use? The Miller test doesn't really touch on that. And so how are we going to deal with that? And the balance that came out was the labeling. That we could now put a label on the music to say what is the problem, what are concerns out there. So it's still out there for public consumption, but the parents now have the choice, or the buyer has the choice of saying, this is what I'm about to listen to. This is what I'm going to consume, and do I want to or not? So that was the compromise between the two sides. For musical confusion, musicians say that musical meaning is a function of context, meaning you need to kind of really listen to the song, and it's when you listen to it is when you start putting the ideas together. Oftentimes, because of that, some of the information that's being passed along is ambiguous to parents. For example, just vocabulary words. There's a not very famous, but there's a story of someone who was reviewing, I don't know, it was one of the boy band, maybe NSYNC, and in the song the singer was using the word shorty all the time. And the guy who was reviewing the album or CD just kept saying, I don't understand why he has this obsession with short women. And so he didn't really get the idea of what was being used with that word. And that's just kind of, a stupid example, but that gives you an idea that sometimes what 40, 50-year-olds listening to a piece of music are going to have a completely different view of an 18-year-old listening to that same piece of music. But you also have that graduating, and then people kind of forget that. We had the same thing with the hippies in the 60s. The music they were listening to had a certain meaning to them, and then their parents were saying, oh, isn't this nice? For example, Jimi Hendrix playing the national anthem on his guitar. The Star Spangled Banner. It had a completely different meaning to the adult generation than it did to the 16, 17, 18-year-olds listening to it at Woodstock. Then that group has now aged and have kids of their own, and they're missing some of the messages that's being put out there because they just don't know the vocabulary, they don't know how things are being referred to. And so sometimes there is musical confusion in what is the actual message. Also, I put here that the sex, drugs, rock and roll stereotype does not justify censorship, since many listeners can take a mature, critical approach to the music. In other words, just because there was always, people always said that sex, drugs, and rock and roll or certain type of music must be obscene, that's a stereotype. Because even if a song does deal with sexual issues, there are people who can take a mature approach to it, listen to it for what it is, and dismiss the inappropriate parts and take the good parts of it. Although we do recognize that there are those who cannot, that they take the message literally and don't really, critically think about what they're listening to. Moral panic. Music has traditionally been a target. And as several different people, and if you really want to read all these studies, I can give you the sites. But often there is a need for society to have something to blame, because in every society, whether we're talking about the ancient Greeks, whether we're talking about 1776 America, whether we're talking about the French Revolution, whatever time period we're talking about, there's always been things that's perceived by society as being harmful and damaging to society and inappropriate, and they need a scapegoat for it. They need to blame something instead of kind of just taking, blame for their own actions. For example, we hear a lot of people talking instead of taking responsibility for their own actions. We hear today a lot of people talking about the moral decay of America, and it's because of the homosexuals or because of, whomever. Well, it's not so easy just to point to one group and say they're the cause of the entire United States going downhill. It's more to that, and it's often easy to just to point at one person and say it's their fault. That's traditionally what has happened with music. Whenever we have new styles of music, it often is seen as harmful and deteriorating society. I show you here that a survey from 2000 surveyed showed that most women, married participants, churchgoers, and those who held conservative opinions toward gender roles, thinking that basically kind of a woman should be barefoot and pregnant, they had a severe dislike for rap and heavy metal music. So that tends to tell us that there's a certain group of people who feel threatened by rap, heavy metal, because either they don't understand the message or they stereotype what the message is. We also see similar surveys like this in the 1950s showed a dislike for rock music when rock was new. In the 1970s, they showed the same dislikes because of disco music, because it was going to lead to sexual promiscuity, etc. We see that now with rap, and whatever the next musical genre is to come out, we're going to see people blaming it for problems as well. Because societies, and it's not just the US, don't think I'm pointing a finger at us now, it really is all societies have always wanted to point to something and say that is our problem, and as long as if we fix that, if we get them out of the way, things will be okay. I mean, look back to Salem and the witchcraft panic. Things were not going the way that the people had hoped at the time, and they said, oh, it's witches, and if we just get rid of those witches, everything will be perfect. Well, of course, we know that they tried to get rid of the witches and things still didn't work out perfectly. So there's often this finger pointing that happens, and that's the issue with moral panic. Media effects. There's been lots of studies that claim that music is harmful to society, although most of the studies then have to kind of follow up at the end saying there's not a lot of evidence to back that up, because the issue is, if we're going to say that rock music is bad for us, well, people who listen to rock music, well, they've gotten older, their thoughts have matured, they think differently now, and so we can't really look at them for long-range effects. Then we end up getting, disco coming in. Well, those people mature, their attitudes change. And so we often are seeing that there's no real assertion to back that it's harmful to society as a whole, although it has an impact on the people who are listening to it at the time, especially young people who are still forming their opinions and are not used to thinking critically about the material. Um, Psychiatrists have put two and two together with people who were bipolar, people who are having severe depression. If they listen to music that is also depressing, that's talking about suicide, those people are more likely to at least attempt suicide. So there is a correlation there. But for the general health of a society, there's nothing so far to show that music really harms it, no matter how obscene the music is. And throughout the past 30 years, courts have almost categorically refused to ever allow a music made me to do a defense. In other words, I've listened to a lot of violent rap music, and then I went out and raped a woman, or I went out and mugged somebody. Well, the music is what made me want to do it. Courts have just absolutely rejected that. That as soon as you're an adult, you should know right from wrong, and a song should not have that kind of control over you. Importance of music. And this is where we start getting to the heart of the issue of how much are we going to put in there, how much emphasis are we going to allow, how much emphasis are we going to put on who's listening to it and how it's impacting them. A survey from 1987 said that almost half of 11 to 18-year-olds say music is very important to their life, so we know they're listening. And so if we have them listening, let's say 11, 13-year-olds listening to violent imagery in music or denigrating music that denigrates women, then that is possibly going to have an impact on them, because this is their formative years. This is when they're starting to form their adult opinions, and they're constantly hearing this reinforcement of violent and misogynistic attitudes. In 1990, 7th through 12th graders said out of everything that they could take to a desert island, music would be the first thing. And again, 13 to 17-year-olds said music was the most important activity in their life in 1996. So consistently over the past 20 years, when asked, we do see a lot of people, young people, 11 to 15, saying how important music is. Change in music themes, that I'm just quickly running through a couple of different things for you here. 50 years ago, most of the themes of music was boy meets girl. That was the message of, oh, I'm falling in love, she's so cute, let me woo her, now we get married. Nowadays, we don't really have that boy meets girl. It's a much more sexual message. So we go from something, very innocent, from, like, let's say Wake Up Little Susie, which was simply, a boy and girl falling asleep, ostensibly, quote unquote, while out on the town, and so they're afraid of what the father's how he's going to react when he takes her home, to almost hearing sexual intercourse in songs. So we've changed what the boundary is of what we will accept.